Hi, my name is Mike, and as I said, I'm the Education Manager at the Trevor Project. For those of you who don't know, the Trevor Project is the nation's leading organization in crisis intervention and suicide prevention for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth. Before we begin launching into the slides, I'll tell you just a little bit about the Trevor Project. Our flagship program is a Lifeline, which is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week crisis intervention warm line for LGBT youth. Young people call who are actively suicidal, but a lot of young people who call have questions about LGBT identity or relationship issues or problems with their family, a lot of things that don't have anything to do with being LGBT. So a variety of different topics are discussed on that line. We also have Trevor Chat, which is an instant messenger one-on-one with a counselor service that we provide. And Dear Trevor, which is a letter writing service where young people can write letters into Trevor, and they are responded by a counselor, which can be found on our website, www.trevorproject.org. And we also provide lifeguard workshops, which is an umbrella term for the workshops that we do for youth in schools and service organizations, and service provider workshops discussing best practices for working with LGBT youth. And those are available in the state of California and New York for free, and a small fee in other places. So we can launch right into the slides. So being alert to the stress of young people is extremely important to creating a safer environment. Noting every time what happened, knowing who was involved, what happened, where it happened, when it happened, who it was reported to, and if there were any witnesses. And the reason for that is because we know that a very small population of young people are actually bullied, but that bullying event, that harassment, contributes to a negative environment. So that means there's generally one bully, one victim, and about 28 bystanders in any classroom environment. Every one of those students is impacted by that action in some way or another. A great way to create an inclusive environment is to document it every single time. If there's documentation, there's a record of what's happening, why it's happening, and why it's not being stopped. So later, when it does become an issue and it's brought to the attention of the school district or the community, you can be able to say, well, it was documented and this is why it's important to be able to emphasize these actions and behaviors that are occurring in our schools. Slide. So some very small steps that every person can do to create a more inclusive environment. Some of this is a little bit repetitive, so we'll take the second to go through it. Speak up and challenge young people who make homophobic or anti-gay remarks. It's best practice to create a conversation surrounding those comments. Again, start with it in the beginning of the year, be consistent, and it will eliminate a lot of those conversations having to take place, and again, identifies you as an allied adult. Working with youth organizations, schools, community centers to have programs on respect, school safety, anti-bullying, and to be an advocate for school policies that challenge bias and promote safety, respect, and generally equality and inclusivity throughout the community is a great step. The use of inclusive language, inclusive questions. So for example, if you're talking to a young woman saying, are you dating someone, rather than saying, do you have a boyfriend? It's more inclusive, and it achieves the same end as asking a more general question that assumes that everyone is heterosexual. Another great way is if you're a straight ally, to use inclusive language in the way of referring to your significant other as your partner. Generally, people assume that if you have a partner that you are a LGBT person, and if you're straight, it's a great way to open a conversation and say, no, I'm straight, but I'm a supportive allied adult. Displaying items that show your support for LGBT people is also a great way. Go through GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, safe space training. Display Trevor Project materials, display LGBT inclusive materials, comment on, the episode of Glee that you saw last night, those kind of things. Noting that you are an open and allied person creates an environmental safe space. Not assuming that everyone is heterosexual is extremely important to this as well. Keeping in mind that everything that you say is being watched by these young people that you're working with, and they'll pick up on these things a lot more so than you will. So by educating yourself and your fellow peers, the adults in your area, and requiring that cultural competency be part of the training that you and other service providers experience, you can create a more inclusive environment with very, very small steps. You can also advocate for the inclusion of voluntary demographic questions on orientation, gender identity, expression, domestic partnership status, parents and spouses' gender, to statewide surveys that are distributed throughout schools in order to have more data collection for LGBT young people and more allocations of resources. One person can make a difference, and a follow-up point to that is that research shows that having one staff member in a school reduces the likelihood of negative mental health outcomes and suicide attempts by a third. So it only takes one person in each school to take away 1/3 of the likelihood that a young person will attempt suicide. And that's pretty powerful to that 1/3 of the population. Slide. Some tips for providers. It's not our place, never our place, to tell a young person when, where, whether, or how they should come out. It's a really individualized experience that's very, very different for each person. You have the young person who comes out and everybody's like, so what? That's great. We love you anyways. Life goes on as normal. And then you have the person who is kicked out of their home and experiences a lot of traumatic environmental impacts on their coming out and everything in between. The point is that you're getting a very, very, very small piece of the story and a very small piece of the puzzle. And you should let them make the decision. You should let them make the call. It is our duty as service providers to be able to help them iron out what is real versus the perceived dangers of coming out. Also, it's important to note the heightened need for confidentiality. If you're working in a school setting and a young person comes out to you and you're a teacher, that's not necessarily something that needs to be included in conversations in the lunchroom or in the staff room or with other members of the staff, because you don't know when this is going to be brought up or when it is appropriate to be talked about. Keeping it confidential is extremely important. Also, in relation to suicide, when you're working with parents, it is a best practice and state law in some states that you are not allowed to disclose the sexual orientation or gender identity of their student to the parents, should you know it. And we suggest with the Trevor Project that that is best practice regardless of the state law in which you decide. Slide. LGBT youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide as their heterosexual peers. So this is because of the way they're treated in their homes, their schools, their various communities. It's important to note that it's not, oh, well, I'm going to come out as LGBT, so that means that I'm automatically more likely. It's because of that negative environmental influence. Also note that LGBT youth who are from highly rejecting families are 8 times as likely to have attempted suicide than LGBT peers who report no or low levels of family rejection. When we're talking about family rejection, it can be anything from huge, kicking somebody out of their house because of their identity, or something subtle as, why can't you be more masculine, or why can't you be more feminine? That is creating a rejection in the environment. Also, 75% of LGBT youth have reported verbal abuse, while 15% report physical abuse at their school. More than a third will lose friends through coming out, and increased victimization and losing friends both predict negative mental health outcomes, including substance abuse and, unfortunately, suicide. Slide. So this slide reports Caitlin Ryan's research from the Family Acceptance Project. Highly recommend reading her research. It's wonderful, and talks about family behaviors, talks about environment, talks about what the community impact is. And these are behaviors and environments that will increase risk for mental health issues, ultimately including suicide. I'm going to point out just a couple, but blocking access to LGBT friends, events, and resources is a big one. Young people are going through an identity formation. They're determining who they are, figuring out what fits for them, and this is regardless of how they identify in terms of orientation. Adolescence is a time of self-exploration, figuring out what is important to you and what is not important to you, and learning social norms. When young people are blocked from activities, resources, friends, and families, family members that are LGBT, it creates a negative impact and ultimately a heightened risk for negative outcomes. Also know, pressuring a child when they're discriminated against because of their LGBT identity does increase risk. So what does that mean? The situation where you have the young man at school who wears a purse, and the school social worker is just saying, well, man, if the kid just stops wearing the purse, then we wouldn't have to deal with it. Well, no, that's not true. Because if it wasn't the purse, it would be the way he walks or the way he talks or the way his hair is or a million other factors. And that is, my friends, heteronormativity. What it is, our responsibility, regardless of your profession, it is your first responsibility to do no harm. And in that situation, you want to create a safe space for that individual. It's not about the purse, it's about the environment. And when you blame that young person and just say, well, they wouldn't pick on you if you got rid of the purse, that creates a risk and ultimately creates negative mental health situations and environments that include increasing risk for suicide attempts. Along the same line, pressuring a child to be more or less masculine or feminine and not supporting gender expression goes along the same way. So it can be school, but it can also definitely be attributed to family and direct social groups. But so there's good news. There are behaviors that we can all do that reduce risk for suicide, both in the family, in the community, and in the school. Being able to talk with a young person about their LGBT identity or about questioning that identity and not showing our own personal bias. Being a sounding board for them to come to, and you know what? Admitting when you don't know. If you don't know, refer them to somebody who does. Send them to the Trevor Project website. Send them to GLSEN's website. Find out that information and be able to support that young person in exploring their identity or questioning that identity. Being able to express affection when you learn that a young person is LGBT and supporting them even if you're uncomfortable. Being able to be that being able to be that one person that reduces the risk by 1/3 is a big takeaway here. Advocating for that young person when he or she is mistreated because of their identity. And honestly, just truly believing that a young person can have a happy, healthy, and productive future as an LGBT adult will go a long way in reducing risk for suicide.